Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. Carl Gustav Jung wrote these words not as a philosopher, but as a man who had faced the storm within. For 4 long years he walked the edge between sanity and madness. He spoke with invisible voices, sketched the faces of his visions, and filled crimson pages with the dialogue of his soul. This was no ordinary man. He was a celebrated Swiss psychiatrist, the student of Freud, the pioneer of modern psychology. And yet he chose to risk everything: his name, his career, his mind. His colleagues whispered that he'd lost touch with reality. But Jung was not losing his mind, he was mapping it. He descended into the darkness of his own unconscious. And when he returned, he carried something extraordinary. A map of the human soul itself. Before we begin, a quiet note. We know you're here to rest. So while a few short ads help us keep telling these stories, we've limited them to the beginning. After that, the night flows undisturbed. And if these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. Because tonight we follow the man who dared to go mad, to understand the darkness within us all. This is the Bedtime Biography of Carl Jung. It was the autumn of 1913 in Küsnacht, a quiet village on the shores of Lake Zurich, Switzerland. The evening mist rolled in over the water, and the house of Carl Gustav Jung, then 38 years old, stood like a lantern against the fading light. He had everything a man could desire: a respected career, a loving wife, 5 children, and a reputation as Sigmund Freud's most promising disciple. But inside him something was breaking. That year, as Europe drifted toward the First World War, Jung began to sense a different kind of storm, not in the world outside but within himself. He started to see visions, rivers of blood flooding the continent, ancient gods returning through the fog of modern reason. They came without warning, overwhelming him with images so vivid that he feared for his sanity. Yet instead of resisting, he made a choice that would change the course of psychology forever. He decided to let the visions in. Every night he sat in his study, the clock ticking softly, the smell of candle wax and ink thick in the air, and waited. He called this his confrontation with the unconscious. And soon the visions came like visitors from another realm. He saw a wise old man, a serpent, a young girl, a red-robed figure whom he would later name Philemon, his inner guide. From December 1913 to 1917, Jung filled page after page in what he called Liber Novus, the new book, which the world would one day know as the Red Book. It was not a diary. It was a map, a descent into his own psyche. Each entry was written as if he were traveling through an underworld of symbols, where gods and demons spoke the language of the soul. The walls of his study became both a temple and a battlefield. Outside, the snow fell quietly over Zurich. Inside, Jung wrestled with visions that blurred the line between revelation and madness. He later wrote, "To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed." He was not painting art. He was documenting his own descent, with the precision of a scientist and the faith of a mystic. And as the war erupted across Europe in 1914, Jung began to realize something terrifying. The blood he had seen in his dreams was not only his, it belonged to the entire world. gentle pause. And so, as the night deepened, Jung continued to walk the thin line between reason and revelation, believing that the only way to heal the human soul was to first enter its madness. By 1916, the world outside Jung's window had turned to chaos. The First World War had swallowed Europe in a roar of artillery and grief. But inside his home in Küsnacht, a quieter, stranger battle was being fought, one between the conscious mind and the depths beneath it. Jung no longer feared the visions. He invited them. He would close his eyes, breathe deeply, and slip into a world that existed just behind the veil of waking life. He called this process active imagination. It was part meditation, part dream, part descent, a conversation with the hidden parts of the soul. In those moments, Jung said, the air grew dense as if time itself were listening. The figures would come to him, not as hallucinations but as teachers. Among them was Philemon, an old man with kingfisher wings and wise, ancient eyes. To Jung, Philemon was not a fantasy. He was a representation of something vast, the living symbol of wisdom that exists in all humans, the archetype of the wise old man. One afternoon, as Jung walked through his garden by Lake Zurich, he saw a kingfisher, a bird rarely seen in that region, land on a stone. At that moment he felt that his visions had stepped into reality. Philemon was no longer a dream. He had crossed over. That day Jung wrote in the Red Book, Philemon taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. In the candlelit silence of his study, Jung drew Philemon's face again and again. An ageless being with calm eyes and a flowing beard of blue fire. He spoke to him about the nature of the soul, the danger of ego, and the need for balance between light and darkness. Outside, the newspapers screamed of death counts and ruined cities, but Jung's war was inward. He saw the same rage that tore Europe apart mirrored within the human psyche. He began to understand that every nation, every man carries within him both the creator and the destroyer. In 1916, Jung wrote an essay titled, The Seven Sermons to the Dead. It came to him, he claimed, after hearing strange knockings in his house for several nights. He believed the dead themselves demanded to be heard, and so he wrote what they told him. The voice that spoke was not Jung's. It was that of a figure named Basilides, an ancient Gnostic teacher who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century. For Jung, this was no seance, no performance. It was revelation. He believed that the soul communicates in symbols and myth, and that to ignore these inner messages is to cut ourselves off from the truth of who we are. As his pen moved across the crimson pages, Jung understood that what others called madness was, for him, a necessary passage, a dark forest that one must walk through to find meaning again. And when the final words of the 7 sermons were written, the noises ceased. The air grew still. He felt, for the first time in years, a quiet sense of completion. He had met his shadow, spoken to his dead, and lived to tell the tale, softly like a breath. And so, as the fire burned low and night returned to the lake, Jung closed his book, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. To bring his visions back into the waking world, and make sense of them for the rest of us. By 1917 the Great War raged on, and much of Europe was drowning in despair. Yet, within the quiet walls of Carl Jung's home in Küsnacht, something entirely new was being born, A Psychology of the Soul. He had spent 4 years wandering through visions and symbols, speaking with Philemon, facing his shadows, and confronting the figures of his imagination. Now it was time to translate madness into meaning. Jung began sketching diagrams, circles within circles, mandalas of astonishing complexity. He believed these images were not random but universal, that they belonged not only to him but to everyone. Each symbol, he realized, was a doorway into what he called the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the mind shared by all human beings, containing the inherited memories and instincts of the entire human race. As he worked, he began to recognize recurring patterns. The wise old man, the mother, the hero, the shadow, the child. They appeared across myths, religions, and dreams from every culture and era. The same figures that haunted his nights also appeared in the tales of ancient Egypt, Greece, and India, in the visions of mystics, in the stories of creation, and in the nightmares of ordinary people. He called these patterns archetypes, the timeless blueprints of the human experience. During those months, Jung often walked along the frozen banks of Lake Zurich, the white silence of winter stretching endlessly around him. He would pick up stones from the shore and carve small figures into them, his way of giving form to the invisible. To his neighbors he was eccentric. To himself he was a traveler between two worlds, the inner and the outer, the visible and the unseen. In his journals he wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Each evening, as the sun disappeared behind the snow-covered Alps, he would return to his desk and study the human soul as if it were a living cosmos. He saw the psyche not as a machine, but as a vast and sacred landscape, a temple built from memory, myth, and emotion. In 1919, Jung delivered a series of lectures in London, titled The Psychological Foundations of Belief in Spirits. His audience expected science, instead they heard mysticism. He spoke of the unconscious as a reality unto itself, a realm that shapes our choices, dreams, and destinies even as we remain unaware of it. He told them that the modern world had forgotten its myths, and that, without them, people were becoming hollow. The crowd was divided. Some called him a prophet. Others whispered that he had lost his mind. But Jung remained calm. He had seen too much to doubt. He understood now that what he had faced was not insanity. It was initiation. When asked if he still believed in God, Jung smiled softly and said, "I do not need to believe. I know." Outside, the world was rebuilding itself from the ruins of war. Inside, Jung had rebuilt the very definition of the mind. Pause, a quiet reflection. And so, as night fell once again over the calm waters of Zurich, Jung sat in the amber glow of his study, his ink-stained fingers resting on the red leather cover of Liber Novus. He had descended into madness, and returned with a map, not of the stars, but of the human soul. The year was 1921. Europe was healing, slowly, painfully, from the wounds of war. Cities were rebuilding, soldiers were returning, and humanity was learning once again to breathe. But in a quiet corner of Switzerland, Carl Gustav Jung sat at his desk, watching the thin lines of dawn stretch across Lake Zurich. He had survived his own war, not with nations but with the soul. In the stillness of those mornings, Jung's thoughts turned again and again to dreams. He had come to believe that they were not meaningless fragments of sleep, but messages, precise, symbolic, sacred. He once told a student, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul." Each night he would write down his own dreams, then compare them to the myths of Greece, Egypt, and the Bible. He noticed something astonishing. The same symbols appeared across time and culture. A snake, a mountain, a dark cave, a radiant child. To Jung, these were not coincidences. They were the language of the collective unconscious, that ancient, invisible network that connects every human being across centuries. He began to work with his patients differently. Instead of treating dreams as random, he treated them as letters from the soul. When a woman dreamed of drowning, he asked not about her day but about her fears, the emotions pulling her beneath the surface. When a soldier dreamed of walking through fire, Jung saw not madness but transformation, a passage through pain toward renewal. By 1921, he published his monumental work, Psychological Types. In it, he introduced the ideas that would later shape modern personality theory, the terms introvert and extrovert, and the four psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. But beneath all the careful science, his work pulsed with the rhythm of myth and symbol. He wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." In his private journals, he described dreams that felt like prophecies. Oceans rising, temples collapsing, crowds searching for light in the dark. He knew these images were not only his own. They were the world's unconscious speaking through him. He once said that the modern man had become too rational, too afraid of mystery, too proud to kneel before the unknown. Dreams, he believed, were the last bridge between the human and the divine. And so, night after night, he crossed that bridge, not to escape reality, but to remind himself what reality truly was. Outside his study, the wind moved through the reeds by the lake. Inside, his lamp burned softly, casting golden circles of light on the open pages of the red book. The ink had long dried, but the voices within it were still alive, whispering, guiding, watching. Soft reflection. And so, as another dawn rose over Switzerland, Carl Jung leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. The world called him a psychologist, but he knew the truth. He was a cartographer of dreams, mapping the secret geography of the soul. By 1922, Carl Jung's fascination with dreams had evolved into something deeper, a sacred science of symbols. He no longer saw himself as a doctor merely healing the sick, but as a traveler mapping the secret tunnels of the human spirit. He moved to a small lakeside retreat in Balingen, near the upper shores of Lake Zurich. There, away from the chatter of academia, he began building what he called the Balingen Tower, a stone house he designed and constructed by hand. He said it was not just a home but a reflection of his inner world. "Here," he wrote, "I am in the midst of my true life, I am most deeply myself." Every morning Jung would wake to the sound of waves brushing the stones, the smell of damp earth and pine heavy in the air. He would spend the day carving symbols into the tower's walls, suns, serpents, mandalas, each one a mirror of his dreams. At night, he wrote by candlelight, his ink tracing the thin line between psychology and mysticism. It was during these years, between 1922 and 1930, that Jung immersed himself in the study of alchemy, mythology, and religious symbolism. He saw in the alchemist's ancient drawings the merging of sun and moon, the rebirth of gold from black ash, a perfect metaphor for the human psyche. To Jung, alchemy was never about turning metal into gold. It was about transforming the soul. He wrote, "The alchemist projected the process of individuation into matter, while we now know it to be a psychic process. Alchemy, he realized, was the dream of the Middle Ages, the language through which the unconscious had once tried to heal itself. Now it was his task to translate that forgotten dream for the modern age." During this time, Jung began working with patients who felt spiritually lost. He asked them not about symptoms but about their symbols. He asked what they saw in their dreams, what colors returned again and again, what animals, what faces, what voices. He believed the psyche was always speaking. We simply needed to learn how to listen. In 1928, a friend sent Jung a copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He was fascinated. Its teachings about death, rebirth, and the journey of the soul through symbolic realms echoed the same truths he had seen in his own inner visions. He wrote that the East had long understood what the West had forgotten, that to live fully one must also understand death, for both are parts of the same great rhythm. That year, Jung carved into a stone at Balingen a Latin inscription that read, "Vocatus ac non vocatus, Deus adorat." Called or not called, God will be present. It was both a warning and a promise. For Jung, it meant that the unconscious, the divine within, is always near whether we invite it or not. He once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The wind outside whispered through the tall grass, and the tower stood silent against the lake, a monument not of stone but of awakening, gentle reflection. And so, as the moon rose over Balingen and shadows danced along the water, Jung understood that dreams were not an escape from life. They were its secret pulse, the slow heartbeat of the universe within us all. It was the early 1930s, and Europe once again trembled on the edge of darkness. The world Jung had known, a world of art, reason, and quiet Swiss order, was beginning to fracture. Fascism rose in Germany, and the shadow of war stretched long across the continent. But long before the armies marched, Jung sensed another kind of darkness awakening, one not born from politics but from the human soul itself. He called it the shadow. For Jung, the shadow was not a myth or metaphor. It was a psychological truth, the sum of all that we deny within ourselves. Our anger, jealousy, shame, fear, and secret desires. Every human being, he said, carries a shadow, and the less it is acknowledged, the darker and more dangerous it becomes. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." During his lectures in 1933 at the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule Zurich (ETH Zurich), Jung warned his students that society itself was projecting its unacknowledged shadow, and that this collective blindness could lead to catastrophe. He could see it forming in the speeches, in the flags, in the blind obedience to ideology. The same forces that he had wrestled with within himself were now moving across nations. In his private journals, Jung described dreams of colossal storms and floods, oceans swallowing cities, masses of people running toward destruction. He feared these were not only personal visions but premonitions of a global descent. Later he would recall, "I had a vision of a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. I saw mighty waves and floating rubble of civilization." This vision came a year before the war. In these years, Jung's therapy became something sacred, almost priestly. When a patient spoke of rage, he did not tell them to repress it. He asked them to meet it. He believed that the only way to transform darkness was to face it consciously. To deny one's shadow, he said, was to hand one's power over to it. He told one student, "You cannot defeat your demons by running from them. You defeat them by giving them a seat at your table." His insight was simple yet terrifying. That evil was not an external force but a potential within every soul. The same mind that builds cathedrals can build concentration camps. The same heart that loves can also destroy. By 1938, as tensions in Europe reached their breaking point, Jung wrote that the modern world was suffering not from hunger or politics, but from a loss of soul. He said mankind had become intoxicated with progress, blind to the ancient truth that every light casts a shadow. He wrote in a letter that year, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." In September 1939, war returned. The Second World War began. And Jung, now in his 60s, watched the world enact on a global scale what he had long feared within the individual, the eruption of the shadow. Night after night, he sat alone by the fire in his study, listening to the radio reports from Berlin, Paris, and London. The crackling voices spoke of invasion, loss, and fear. And Jung thought to himself, "The collective unconscious has awoken, and it is devouring its children." Soft reflection. And so, as bombs fell far beyond the Alps, Carl Jung sat by the flicker of a single candle, a man haunted by the knowledge that the outer war was only a mirror of the inner one. By the end of the war in 1945, Jung was an old man living in Küsnacht, his home overlooking the quiet waters of Lake Zurich. The guns had finally gone silent, but the smoke of humanity's shadow still hung heavy in the air. Entire cities lay in ruins, not only physically but spiritually. He watched the world try to rebuild itself with the same blindness that had led it to destruction. Nations rushed toward technology, power, and ideology, as if the soul, bruised and terrified, no longer mattered. Jung saw this clearly. The outer peace would mean nothing until the inner war was faced. He began to write and lecture again, now focusing on what he called the integration of the shadow. He told his students that after such horror, humanity had two choices: to forget and repeat the darkness, or to look inward and redeem it. In 1946, during a lecture in Zurich, Jung said something that startled many. "The evil that we see in others is in us also. Until we know this, we are prisoners of our own shadow." He believed that every society, like every individual, must confess its shadow before it can heal. Without this honesty, there could be no real peace. As he aged, Jung became quieter, more reflective. He often retreated to his small stone tower on Lake Ballingen, a retreat he had built by hand beginning in 1923. and expanded over the decades as a physical symbol of his soul's growth. There was no electricity, no modern comfort. Only stone, fire, and silence. Here he carved symbols into the walls. Mandalas, suns, snakes, and inscriptions in Latin and Greek. He called Balingen his representation in stone. To him, it was a place where the conscious and the unconscious could meet, a temple to the wholeness he had long sought. In his journals he wrote, "At Balingen I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. There I am, as it were, the age-old son of the mother." He would spend hours watching the play of light on the lake, noting how the surface reflected the sky. A perfect metaphor for the human mind. Consciousness, he wrote, is like a lake surface, and the unconscious the depths beneath it. To know oneself, one must dive. But Jung knew that diving into the depths had its dangers. Many people, he said, mistake introspection for indulgence. To face one's darkness is not to glorify it, but to transform it, to turn poison into medicine. As he guided patients and correspondents from around the world, his letters became quieter, simpler, wiser. He told one young analyst, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." By the 1950s, Jung's ideas began to spread widely, into art, philosophy, literature, even religion. His concept of the shadow, once dismissed as mystical, became central to understanding human behavior. From soldiers haunted by war to ordinary people plagued by guilt, his message resonated deeply. The enemy is not out there. It lives within. And so, as the world rebuilt its cities, Carl Jung quietly rebuilt something rarer. The bridge between light and dark within the human soul. Soft reflection. He once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." Perhaps that is why, even now, his work feels less like psychology and more like scripture. A manual for how to stay human in a world forever on the edge of shadow. Night after night, as the world slept, Carl Jung listened, not to voices in the room, but to whispers rising from the depths of his own mind. In the stillness of Balingen, by the shores of Lake Zurich, he began to see that dreams were not illusions, they were messages. Each image, each strange creature or impossible place, spoke a secret language, the language of the soul. Since his early days under Sigmund Freud, Jung had studied dreams. But unlike Freud, who believed dreams were the disguised fulfillment of forbidden desires, Jung saw them as something sacred. He believed that dreams were the psyche's natural attempt to restore balance, to reveal what the waking mind refused to see. In 1928, Jung received a small golden scarab beetle from a patient's dream, and at that same moment, a real scarab, a rosechafer beetle, flew against his window. It was an ordinary coincidence to most, but for Jung, it was a revelation. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, a moment when the outer world mirrors the inner one. Such events, he said, are reminders that life is not random. It is patterned like a dream, woven from threads of meaning. He wrote in his 1952 essay Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. The psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing. To Jung, dreams, myths, and coincidences were all part of one great pattern. A map of symbols pointing toward unity. He called these recurring patterns archetypes, the timeless figures that appear across all cultures. The hero, the mother, the shadow, the wise old man, the trickster. They were not inventions of imagination, but inheritances of the soul, echoes of what he called the collective unconscious, a deep, shared reservoir of human memory stretching across time and place. In ancient myths he saw the same stories repeating. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, Christ carrying the cross, the Buddha awakening under the Bodhi tree. To Jung these were not separate tales, but variations of the same inner journey. The soul's descent into darkness and its return with light. He taught that symbols are bridges between the known and the unknown. The cross, the serpent, the mandala, all are mirrors of psychic reality. To ignore them is to cut ourselves off from our own wholeness. In 1933, Jung gave a lecture in London, telling his audience, "When a man's conscious life becomes too one-sided, the dreams try to compensate." He smiled as he explained how the psyche restores its balance through images, how the dream of falling may arise when one is too proud, or the dream of flying when one is trapped. Every dream, he said, carries medicine, if only we listen gently enough to hear it. At Balingen, Jung often rose before dawn to record his own dreams. He drew them as circles, mandalas, symbols of unity and selfhood. To him, the mandala represented the center of the soul, the place where opposites, light and dark, reason and instinct, meet in harmony. He believed that to find the self is to discover this center, a truth older than religion, older than civilization itself. He once wrote in his memories, dreams, reflections. The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul, which opens into that cosmic night that was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness. Gentle pause. Perhaps that is why Jung's ideas still haunt us. In an age of logic and light, he dared to honor darkness and symbol. He told us that our dreams are not meaningless flickers, but the night's way of guiding us home. And so, beneath the soft hum of the Swiss wind, Carl Jung continued to write, a man translating the language of eternity into the soft syllables of human understanding. In the final decade of his life, Carl Jung's nights grew quieter, yet his dreams became more vivid. He was no longer merely interpreting symbols, he was living among them. At Balingen Tower, surrounded by the silence of nature, he often described feeling close to eternity. In 1955, tragedy struck when his beloved wife, Emma Jung, passed away. She had been his anchor, his intellectual equal, and his most steadfast companion. Her death shook him deeply, yet Jung did not drown in grief. He entered it like a student entering a sacred text. He wrote, "Where love stops, power begins and violence and terror." To him, love was not just an emotion but a unifying force that bridges life and death. As the years folded into the late 1950s, Jung's health began to fade, but his spirit seemed to grow clearer, like a lantern burning its brightest before it goes out. He spent long hours reflecting on his dreams, writing letters to scholars, theologians, and poets across the world. He spoke of symbols not as theories, but as living realities that breathe through every soul. One of his last great dreams came in 1961, shortly before his death. He dreamt that he was floating high above the earth, seeing the planet from far away, a fragile blue sphere wrapped in mist and light. He felt at peace, unbound by time or space. When he awoke, he whispered to his secretary, "It was as if I had been where creation was still unfinished." That spring, on June 6, 1961, Carl Gustav Jung passed away at the age of 85. In his beloved Küsnacht home overlooking Lake Zurich. The lake was calm that morning, the air soft and clear. He left behind more than books and theories, he left a bridge between worlds, a way for modern humanity to reconnect with the timeless soul within. After his death, his red book, the private journal of his visions, remained locked away for decades. When it was finally published in 2009, the world saw what Jung had risked everything for. A record of his descent into madness, and his return bearing wisdom. The pages glowed with drawings of mandalas, mythic figures, and dialogues between himself and the depths of his own unconscious. Many called it the greatest psychological document ever created. Others saw it as proof that genius and madness are twin stars, orbiting the same inner sun. In his final writings, Jung reminded us that the modern world's obsession with progress comes at a cost. The loss of meaning. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And yet, he believed that even in the chaos of the 20th century, the psyche still speaks, in dreams, in art, in symbols that appear at the edges of our lives. He urged us not to ignore them. The privilege of a lifetime, he said, is to become who you truly are. Gentle reflection. In the end, Jung did not promise peace nor perfection. He offered something more human, understanding. To face the dream, the symbol, the shadow, and through it to meet the self. That is why even now his work feels alive. Every time a dream startles you awake. Every time a symbol seems to follow you through life. Some quiet part of Jung's voice is there, whispering from beyond time. Look within. What you fear is also what will set you free. The year was 1961, and the quiet Swiss village of Küsnacht had just lost its most mysterious inhabitant. Carl Gustav Jung, the man who had walked willingly into the labyrinth of his own mind, was gone. Yet, in a strange way, his departure felt less like an ending and more like a continuation. Because what Jung left behind was not merely knowledge, it was a living map. A map of the human soul. In the decades that followed his death, Jung's ideas began to ripple across the world like circles in still water. His writings were translated into dozens of languages. His students, like Marie-Louise von Franz, Anila Jaffe, and Joseph Campbell, carried his torch into new disciplines. Mythology, art, religion, and even physics. By the late 1960s, the world itself was changing. In America, the counterculture movement was rising. Young minds, weary of war and conformity, turned to Eastern philosophy, meditation, and dreams. They found in Jung's writings a kind of spiritual permission. A bridge between science and mysticism. In 1978, the Jung Institute in Zurich began teaching his methods formally, training generations of analysts who would guide others through the same dark corridors Jung had once walked. His concepts, the shadow, the anima and animus, the collective unconscious, entered not only the language of therapy, but also the language of art. Painters, filmmakers, and musicians drew from his vision. In the works of Ingmar Bergman, in the lyrics of David Bowie, In the novels of Hermann Hesse and Haruki Murakami, you can feel Jung's influence, the dreamlike logic, the mirrored souls, the quiet question, who am I beneath the mask? Even in popular culture, his fingerprints linger. Modern personality systems like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, were inspired by his theory of psychological types. First published in 1921, millions around the world still use it, unknowingly echoing the thoughts of the Swiss doctor who once spoke to his own dreams. But Jung never meant his work to be confined to charts or tests. He believed that self-knowledge was not about labeling, but about uniting the conscious and the unconscious, the rational and the irrational, the light and the dark. This union, he said, is what leads to individuation, the process of becoming whole. In a lecture preserved from 1957, he said softly, "We are not meant to perfect ourselves. We are meant to complete ourselves." Gentle reflection. The difference seems small, yet it is everything. Perfection divides us. Completion reunites us. And perhaps that is why Jung's words still feel alive today. They remind us that peace is not found in escape, but in acceptance of what we are and what we might still become. Decades passed, and yet Jung's shadow only grew longer. In universities, in quiet therapy rooms, in books stacked beside the sleepless, his voice still echoed. Because Jung had not written merely for scholars. He had written for dreamers. For all who sense that beneath the noise of life, something older is calling. In the 1980s, as technology accelerated and cities grew louder, psychologists began rediscovering Jung's message. That no amount of progress can replace the work of the soul. His idea of archetypes began shaping storytelling, film, and design. Hollywood scriptwriters studied his hero's journey, later refined by Joseph Campbell, while spiritual seekers turned to his writings as modern scripture. Artists painted their own mandalas. Therapists used active imagination to help patients speak with their inner worlds. And in churches, temples, and meditation halls, Jung's insights found quiet respect. Even those who never read his books unknowingly lived through his lens. Whenever they said shadow work, or spoke of finding the self. In 2009, when the Red Book was finally published after nearly a century in hiding, a new generation saw the raw soul of Jung for the first time. Its pages, painted in scarlet and gold, revealed not a scientist, but a man who had risked everything to meet his own depths. Critics who once dismissed him as mystical now saw the courage behind his madness. He had lived what he taught, that the psyche is vast, alive, and divine in its mystery. By the 21st century, Jung's work had begun to shape fields far beyond psychology. Quantum physics, artificial intelligence, myth studies, neuroscience, and comparative religion. Physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who had befriended Jung in the 1930s, saw in his theory of synchronicity a clue that mind and matter might not be separate after all. And in 2020, when humanity faced isolation and fear once again, people around the world turned inward, rediscovering the need for meaning, for dream, for symbol. Searches for Jung's name soared. The shadow, it seemed, had returned, and humanity was finally ready to meet it. Soft pause. Jung had once written, "We no longer live in the Middle Ages. God is no longer on his throne, but within the human soul." He did not mean that religion was dead. He meant that the sacred had changed its address. The divine now speaks through dreams, through coincidence, through the silent tug of intuition that says, there is more. In one of his last letters he wrote simply, I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once and cannot add up the sum. Was his final confession. That even after a lifetime of studying the soul, the mystery remained infinite. Gentle reflection. Carl Jung's map was never meant to lead us out of darkness. It was meant to lead us through it. And so long as human beings dream, despair, love, and wonder, his words will echo quietly in the corridors of the mind. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. Whisper soft closing. If these words carried you a little closer to rest, let this channel stay by your side too. For every night holds another story, and every story another mirror, guiding you ever so gently toward the depths within. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Every night we uncover another forgotten soul, another echo from the past still whispering through time. So, if you find comfort in reflection, if you seek meaning in the spaces between light and shadow, then let Global Mystery stay by your side. Subscribe not for noise, but for silence that speaks, for stories that remind you that history isn't gone. It's only sleeping, waiting to be heard again. Because every time we close our eyes to listen, we awaken to the truth that was always ours. Candle Global Mysteries, where the past still breathes.